This video was made possible by viewers like you over on Patreon. Check out the link in the description to hear how you can help make shows like this be even more amazing. Guns. People seem pretty divided by them. On one hand, it's hard to go an entire week without hearing the tragic misuse of a firearm in the good old US of A. And on the other, after the stories I've heard from my uncle that lives in rural Oklahoma, I can understand the need for a boomstick when you're trying to raise chickens in a wilderness full of cougars. In Japan, though, there is no division, because there is no gun ownership. At least, not legally outside of the Keisatsu. Even then, you're lucky to be packing a 9mm. However, very unlike the US, the only heavily publicized account of firearm violence in Japan over the last 5 years was by a guy who made a scrap gun from scratch. Yeah, originally I was going to do this video a few months ago, but suffice to say, that would have been the worst time to talk about Japan's old love of guns. Yeah, you heard me right. While these days in Japan you can get fired from your news reporting job from holding a hunting rifle, from 1543 to 1958, Japan was completely in love with the humble firearm. How much in love? Well, by the late 1500s, during the Sengoku Jidai, Japan possessed more guns than the UK and its colonies. Yeah, by 1556, there were over 300,000 guns in a country roughly the size of California. Oh, and you want to know what's better? At this time, guns were more used by the samurai than katanas. Soul of the samurai indeed. So you might be wondering why all this matters. Well, that's because Japan's unique takes on the early arquebus are some of the most insane designs I've ever seen. Almost Dr. Seussian in nature, yet retaining a level of craftsmanship and elegance that many Japanese weapons are known for. And as a fellow who loves big dumb daka, I, as well as my patrons, want to give some insight into my 5 or 6 favorite flavors of Japanese firearm. Please take note here though that I am no expert in this field by any stretch of the imagination. I just want to share my funny findings in hopes that this invigorates your interest as it did mine. And if it does, I suggest you check out Matt Okuhara, the gun samurai, here on YouTube and on Twitter. He's part of the Matsumoto Castle Gun Corps that keep this practice of holjutsu alive and well after 500 years, so he absolutely knows what he's talking about. He's also helped provide not only crucial information, but also priceless footage to help illustrate what I'm talking about. So before I get into the wacky world of Japanese hinawaju, I wanted to ask Matt to explain some of the basic kinds of firearms and the process of loading, priming, and firing them. Because without a general understanding of the elegance behind these half-a-millennia-old matchlocks, I feel the absurdity and badassness of some of these designs might be lost on people. So first, the firing process.
On the battlefield, a gunner would ideally be able to load and fire within 30 seconds. First of all, some gunpowder and ammunition is put into the barrel and compressed with a ramrod known as a karuka. Some finer gunpowder is put onto the external firing mechanism, and then the hinawa or match cord is held in place above that. Next, the gunner takes aim, then opens the firing mechanism, and then
Next, how about some variations, because there's actually a lot of them.
Just like with modern firearms, guns can be characterized by size and battlefield function. The smallest were tanzutsu and bajozutsu. Next were the mass-produced infantry guns known as banzutsu. Custom-made medium-caliber guns were known as samurai-zutsu because they were custom-made for the samurai. Long-range double-crude guns were known as zamazutsu. Finally, large caliber guns were known as ozutsu.
Pretty sophisticated, huh? Cultured even. So here's where things go off the rails. So something to keep in mind about hinawaju matchlocks is that their caliber is determined by a unit of weight called monmei, which itself is just under 4 grams. A 5-yen coin, for example, weighs 1 monmei. Ashigaru foot soldiers would use guns that shot 2.5 monmei shot, your basic average. Samurai, on the other hand, would use guns that fired 10 monmei shot, and that's a pretty big jump, right? Well, how about 100 monmei shot? That was the upper scale ammunition of the ozutsu. Now for context, the M1819 Hall rifle, a staple of the US military back in the 1800s, shot a ball that was about ½ an ounce in weight. The ozutsu shoots a ball between 3 ounces and 1 pound. That's 6 to 16 times the weight. Now, surprisingly, I couldn't find much information of the origin of the ozutsu, but a handful of other info I found proved interesting. For example, apparently the gunner had to have a very, very specific posture in order to fire the weapon properly, and most of the time it was only samurai that were deemed skilled enough to use this gargantuan weapon. Which, considering how heavy the gun and the shot was, that makes all the sense in the world to me.
Logically, I guess this means that this giant matchlock was terrible when used with infantry versus infantry volley fire, but was incredibly effective at smashing troops in cover, troops tightly packed, all manner of structures, and cavalry units. Big ball, big smash.
Correct! But the one rabbit hole that this gun led me down was just how big did an Ozutsu get? I mean, statistically, any gun that used shot weighing 20 monmei or more was an Ozutsu. So, what was the biggest? Well, the biggest Hinawaju in Japan, known as the Saidai Kyu no Teppo, is on display at the Shitaragahara History Museum in Shinshiro City, and dude, this thing has got to be at least 12 feet long. As far as monmei it shot, I couldn't figure that out, but just look at this thing. I don't know how on earth someone was supposed to use it. It's got a standard Ozutsu stock, so it's designed to be held upright, right? But this thing's gotta be mounted to a barricade or castle wall to be of any freaking use. Granted, I've seen Ozutsu being carried around on wheels, but then I would argue, why not just make it a standard cannon? It's just freaking wild to me to see that this thing even exists. But we're only just getting started on how nutsy Japanese guns could get.
Look, a tiny edible
Cannon.
What's it made of?
wood.
So, what do you do when your hand cart cannons get too heavy and expensive to build out of iron? You build them out of wood. It's funny, because you'd think trying to make a cannon out of a material whose primary purpose is to burn would make for poor cannon crafting material. However, not just Japan, but countries all over the world at this time were making cannons out of wood. In Japan's case, I've seen mokuho reinforced with everything from iron rings to bamboo. Yeah, bamboo. Again, you'd think it'd be too brittle or at the very least too flammable, but dried out bamboo is so strong that it actually could break a katana that struck it. It's incredibly tough stuff. And you need that tough stuff, because when it came to the mokuho cannons, you had a very limited amount of shots before the thing just destabilized. According to my research, the mokuho was first mentioned in a book called the Nankai Jidanki, published in 1663, stating that the Otomo family told Michinao Kono of Iyo about how to make guns, but since it was not easy to cast cannons, they made holes in live pine trees and reinforced them with bamboo. We sank several ships. I've heard that mokuho didn't fire cannonballs, but rather like flame shot or other less weighty projectiles due to, well, the cannon's made of wood. But they are nonetheless just as deadly. So deadly that, according to my research again, these wooden cannons were used up to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904.
So give it up to the humble mokuho, everyone! The one gun you could logically argue your Dungeons & Dragons druid should be able to use.
Moving on from some of the biggest guns in Japan, we switch up to the smallest. I've seen a lot of Hinawaju guns get pretty compact in size, and not gonna lie, they're actually some of my favorite. Danzutsu pistols are like the highly decorative chodes of the rifle world, but they're not the smallest. That title goes to the Nigiri Teppo. Now, unlike the rest of these guns, the Nigiri Teppo wasn't a matchlock that used a hiputa loaded with priming powder. Instead, it used a small amount of fulminated mercury to act as the firing mechanism. And the thing about fulminated mercury is that it can explode very easily from relatively basic friction. That's why the Nigiri Teppo has this big old squeeze handle instead of a standard trigger.
Man, with the thing that dinky, what kind of monmei shot could it even load?
Well, that's the thing about Nigiri Teppo. They were less about being long-range weapons and being more about melee-range blank shooters. Because if you were able to push this thing up against even an armored target and squeezed, you're blowing a hole in someone. But primarily, I've read that the Nigiri Teppo made for a better distraction weapon, either acting as a massive flashbang to disrupt melee combatants, or using it to replicate the sound of a firing squad to distract distant enemies. After all, only powerful samurai and daimyo had access to guns, so typically this made enemies run to their front door, allowing folks like shinobi to sneak in and around back while everyone was focused on the front. Yeah, ninja loved these things, and some even say they invented them. But ninja loved everything gunpowder related, so who could really say? Some historians state that the first ever rifle grenades came into being during the Russo-Japanese War by Japanese Colonel Amazawa at the Battle of Port Arthur. Now, while I would agree that the first ever rifle grenades came from the Japanese, the very first ones were actually developed 300 years prior to this date in the form of the amazing yet baffling bohia. I say baffling because much like the early heat rifle grenades of yore, I'm not sure if this is technically a grenade or a rocket. Much like the Intergut anti-tank rifle grenade, it's got a chunky frame, yet it's also got stabilization fins. So, rocket, grenade, whatever. This 15th century projectile accessory is freaking nuts. The bohia is comprised of a thick wooden frame with metal stabilization fins, a hard and sometimes pointed metal cap to pierce targets, and a waterproof fuse of hemp that was slipped into the core of the arrow, connecting it to a powder charge. After loading the bohia into a larger Hinawaju gun, like the Ozutsu, it was then angled and the hemp fuse was lit to send the grenade rocket flying to its target.
Wait, that's not an Otsutsu. I mean, it kinda looks like one, but it's on a flat board.
Ah, now that's a Hyazutsu. Much like how early World War I rifle grenades evolved into mortars and dedicated handheld launchers, the bohia were also fired from dedicated mortar-like Hyazutsus, or even cannons specifically made to fire bohia called Hia Taiho. Anyway, as far as what this gun accessory did specifically, I'm not 100% sure. My research says that the majority of the time the shaft was wrapped in burning rope and the bohia followed its namesake as being an arrow of fire to torch buildings and gates. However, I've also seen historians say that the bohia was explosive, filled with lead shrapnel as an anti-infantry or an anti-light structure weapon. Either way, the bohia was especially popular at sea, and I can absolutely see why. Infantry using this thing could either set ships ablaze or just punch holes in the hull. It was an alpha build of the modern grenade launcher / rifle grenade, and very much worthy of being put on this list of Japan's wackiest matchlock weapons. Well, here we are, everyone. The wildest weapon in Japan's long history of mystifying matchlocks. And it's not just one gun, but rather an entire family of Hinawaju-style guns that would give Dr. Seuss a run for his money. The Renpatsu Shiki guns. Let's start with the first sibling of this style of rifle. This elegant yet insane looking thing. This is the Sanrenpatsu Rine Shiki Hinawaju, one of the first rotating continuous fire matchlocks. Invented by Gaiki Inoue and Genwa back between 1615 and 1624. Hired by the Edo Bakufu shogunate, Inoue created a matchlock gun that had 3 barrels that could rotate and fire in order. But this is just the beginning, because eventually the Rokuren Patsu Shiki was developed. Twice the barrels, twice the boom. And this looks pretty incredible, right? Like, how could it possibly be topped? Well, it was. There was another Inoue gunsmith that made something even more crazy. At the request of Iemitsu Tokugawa, Inoue Masatsugu created the biggest boomstick I have ever seen from this time period, the Nichu Renpatsu Se Hatsuju. And as this name suggests, this ridiculous matchlock had 20 barrels. 20 barrels that all fired at the same time. Inoue bundled the barrels 3x3 and lined them up in a cone of 7 rows so that 100 feet away, each shot would be spaced out at 25cm intervals. And each one of those barrels shot a 3 Monmei ball. Basically the shot output of 20 Ashigaru foot soldiers standing in a fan formation.
Dude, that would take like 15 minutes to reload. How often was this freaking monster even used in history?
I have no idea how often this thing was used or if it was ever widely produced. But I do know that the many variations of this gun featuring 5 to 8 barrels do exist in museums across Japan. So knowing that, we can at least confirm that the Renpatsu Shiki style matchlocks did see combat. God, 20 barrels. And there you have it. I know there's a lot of other crazy Hinawaju that I could have put on this list, but these were the ones that just utterly knocked my socks off in terms of just how incomprehensibly wild they were. So, for a country that has some of the strongest gun laws in the world, I find it fascinating that Japan of all places have historically made some of the biggest and craziest guns of the 17th century. Thanks for watching, everyone, and a big thank you to Matt for the help. Again, be sure to check him out as Gun Samurai here on YouTube and on Twitter. And as always, a huge thank you to my patrons who let me make dumb videos about goofy Japanese guns like this. Don't worry, that illegal ramen video will be coming in the next few months at the very least. So, sub up, get notified, and check back every other week for new uploads. But until then, everyone, this is Gaijin Goombah, signing out.